Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
And we are coming to you from these United States of America here on Iowa Catholic Radio, where you may be listening to us live, you may be listening to the rebroadcast, you may be listening online, but anywhere you're listening, we are glad to have you here on the show. Thank you for listening. We want to thank our sponsors of the show, Mercy College of Health Sciences, who makes this show possible. Mercy College, mchs.edu. Bud, that's where we both work. I'm the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and Director for the Center for Human Flourishing. What do you do at Mercy College?
I am the Associate Provost, and I've already broken my New Year's resolutions.
Which was?
Eat less. But if you have the resolution to, break into a new exciting career field, Mercy College of Health Sciences might be a place you want to look.
That's right, mchs.edu. We're in full swing with the beginning of our new semester, but we have summer semester, of course, fall coming up. So make sure to go check that out, mchs.edu. Once again, thank you, Mercy College, for underwriting our show. Bud, this is episode number 2 with the new way we're doing this, our new format. And, of course, the sort of theme of the first crop of shows is new beginnings. I hope people got to listen last week, or if they didn't get to live, they can go back and listen to it. There's a lot of good stuff I thought we were bringing up about the sort of ever-ancient, ever-new quality of Christianity itself. So to sort of show that off, we're going to bring in a special guest, Brett Robinson, who not only is our friend, our colleague, we've been a part of this, what we'll talk about, the Church Communication Ecology program with him. I've been able to have the good fortune of giving talks with him. We're working together on projects, but he is the director of basically church digital life at the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame University. Excited to have him for our first interview with some surprises. We're going to actually let the guest ask some questions. So I'm looking forward to this episode quite a bit, Bud.
Yeah, that was a great experience, that program. And so it will be exciting to kind of try to distill some of that for our listeners. I'm a little nervous about being in the hot seat. Not sure what Brett's going to ask us. He doesn't strike me as a guy who's prone to gotcha questions.
That's right. I don't think he's going to be like, so, Bud, how much did you fail your New Year's resolution or anything like that?
Yeah, hopefully he's not listening to this opening segment. It might give him ideas.
Well, folks, we're excited to have this again. We want to thank everyone at Iowa Catholic Radio for letting us go back to this old new format. But like we said, new beginnings, and I think that's indicative itself that new things always come from old things, and so the digital world is not this alien thing that came down from heaven, but what is it, and how does theology in the church give us a new understanding, a new dawn for the digital age? So this is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. We're going to be interviewing our good friend Brett Robinson on the digital age and what the church has to say about it. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Wonderful to be here with you. Thank you for listening to the show. This is show number 2 in our new year with our new format. And, of course, the theme, as we've just said, is new beginnings. So we wanted to invite on the show someone that when we think of new beginnings, Bud, the first person that comes to mind is our good friend who is an Uncommon Good All-Star. He's been on the show multiple times, but Dr. Brett Robinson, Director of Catholic Media Studies at the McGrath Church Life Center at Notre Dame University. Brett, thanks you for coming back on the show, and thank you for being the guinea pig for our first guest on the new old format.
Thank you, guys. It's great to be back and great to be new again.
Well, we've talked about this with the very first show that aired last week. The church is nova et vetera, ever ancient, ever new, and that there's this real way in which whatever new beginnings, as we understand it as Christians, is always going to be intensely wrapped up and tied up with what has come before, but often there's not this very obvious change. We talked about the sort of figure ground stuff, which Bud and I both had the chance to learn from you and some of the programs we're going to talk about, that there's a way in which things can look the same, but when the grounding changes, when the context changes, there can be revolutionary new ways to understand what is familiar. And so the reason I think that you are the natural person to talk about new beginnings on our new show in the new format is because the work you do with the church and digital life, where if it hasn't happened yet, it's really time for a new beginning to deal with something which actually has been around for a few decades. So in that light, if you don't mind telling the good people listening, you started the church communication ecology project. Bud and I had the great privilege of being a part of that at Notre Dame, at Pittsburgh, some of the things we've done. But this initiative, I think, is exactly indicative of this idea of new beginnings, taking what people are probably overly familiar with and shifting the ground with theology, philosophy, the church itself, to understand it in a new light. So if you don't mind to introduce all of this, sort of ground people in what the CCEP is.
Yeah, so not to be confused with the CCCP. The name, I guess, bears some explanation. So it's kind of a conglomerate of a couple different ideas, but very unified ideas. So church communications ecology, what does that mean? So a lot of people hear that and they think, oh, this is like how the church communicates. Church communicated throughout time, through writing and preaching and through new means and technologies, et cetera. And that's certainly part of it. But we add on this ecology idea because we're trying to understand how the church communicates and how it can communicate well in an environment that has changed. So that's where the ecology part comes from. If you think of an ecosystem, when something in the ecosystem changes, a new species introduced or a pollutant or something is introduced into a biological ecosystem, it changes the relationship of everything in that system. And importantly, if there is a new addition or a change, then it can impact the survival of that ecosystem. So when we think about culture, again, another kind of biological metaphor lies within that word, but whether it be agriculture or the culture of a petri dish, et cetera, how does culture change and how does culture either thrive, flourish, or survive under new conditions? And we're under new communications conditions in the digital environment that bear some interrogation and some examination and analysis. And so what we hope to do with church leaders was say, okay, you're coming from all sorts of different areas of expertise and ministry and leadership. And regardless of what area you come from, these issues, changes, adaptations are going to affect what you do. So if you are a pastor and you are trying to preach in a way that's relevant and resonant with the culture, then understanding what's happening in digital life certainly has to be a part of that. We had a number of seminarians and pastors do the program. Some launched pastoral plans for their parish to deal with the question of, what happens when, for instance, your parish gets politically divided because of all the time spent on social media and all the polarization happening there. We also heard from pastors who used social media to kind of look for the sort of topics and questions that were on the minds of Catholics in the Twitter sphere, as it were, and to use that to build homilies and to respond in that way. So there's some very productive things that can be done, along with some of the cautions and warnings that come along with life in the digital world, not the least of which is, parenting young children in this environment, doing youth ministry, teaching and education is certainly changing. Think of COVID, think of the changes that happened in education there with at-home school, online school, that extended into worship, people watching Mass online, that hasn't gone away. So that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. And that's why we spend, 6 months with folks to look at all these issues from these angles and try to figure out ways forward. And so it's a hopeful project. It's not a dire sort of pessimistic thing, but it's realistic.
Brett, when we analyze culture and think about how technology impacts culture, one thing that I found really challenging about the seminar is that it's tempting to try to freeze time or go back to a more pristine era. And so we say, like, if this one factor had not been introduced, we'd be in a pure or better state. And we kind of tried to resist that temptation in our conversations as part of the project. But I do, like you mentioned, parents and the task of parenting today. A lot of my friends and colleagues do feel instinctively like there's something uniquely dangerous or challenging about digital media. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts. Like, I guess sometimes it's connected to our faith as a very like incarnational religion or practice, and digital media oftentimes feels very excarnational or non-tangible, like almost as cutting against the grain of communion. Do you think there's something kind of uniquely challenging about digital media, or does it simply feel that way because it's the one we're facing right now?
No, I think it's uniquely challenging. And I should say, Bud and Bo, you were, as you mentioned briefly at the beginning, part of this program. And which is why I'm looking forward to grilling you in the second half of this show, because
see if we listen.
As it happens when the student kills the master, I think we've reached that point with you guys because you've really internalized so many of the themes here and brought them to life in really amazing ways. So I can't wait to talk about that. But I know we're also all fathers here, and I know there's parents listening, and that is a big question with regard to kids. And that's actually why that was probably the first kind of motivating instinct that got me into all this 20 years ago, was when we had our first child. And that two big questions came to mind. What am I passing on to my child in terms of a faith tradition? So there was a bit of a intense reversion happening as a new father, as you realize you got to know this stuff to pass it on. As a cradle Catholic, sometimes you take some things for granted or forget other things. So doing that was important. But it was also 2004, 2005. And so it was, just before the dawn of the smartphone, but the internet had certainly arrived. Social media wasn't quite on the scene yet, but there was something gnawing at me there as well. And that's when I stumbled into Marshall McLuhan, the Catholic media theorist, who I hope we can talk a little bit about through the program. But through reading him and just by chance, actually returning to the Latin Mass around that time, this whole question of kind of culture, technology, tradition, parenting all converged. And to me, I guess I tend to think in convergent ways, like how do all these things connect? And it became abundantly apparent to me that there was deep connections between how we communicate, how we worship, how we parent and pass on the faith. And so I think there's something. You asked if digital is unique. I think it is because there's a suddenness to it, whereas when printing press was introduced, for example, and literacy became widespread, we had about 500 years to kind of adapt to that environment, from an oral and kind of scribal culture to a print culture. So that was a gradual and steady process of becoming people of the book. And of course, it spawns all sorts of things like the Enlightenment and philosophical movements that rely on the ability for text to be shared across many people and across time and so on. But once you hit the 20th century and you hit electric media, a lot of people say, why is electric different from digital? That's one of the distinctions we try to make, too, in the program. And I think there is something different. But I think, to your question, I think there's a massive sea change or shift, late 19th century, early 20th century, once communication goes electronic and, as you say, discarnate or without bodies. We communicate without bodies when we're on the air, on the phone. We're doing it right now. I can't see you guys. I wish I could. But that changes things and it changes relationships. And so parents have to think about that because it changes the way kids interact with each other, with the world, but also the speed at which they interact with each other in the world. And I think if we can talk a little bit more about that later, that's, to me, probably the biggest shift is the speed of communication and what that does at all levels: social, psychological, spiritual.
That to me is where this really lies, because on one hand, I mean, again, we all know each other and we talk about this a lot. Brett and I are currently working on it, but we've given talks on this, so I'm trying not to trying to make sure to say everything out loud that I'm thinking so that people listening to the show know where this is going. I'm not like the apologist for the digital, but I always try to tell people where it seems like the digital and things like print are radically different. There's usually a connection. It's just that it's muted or we don't think about it. The speed, I think, is where this gets up, because we know that things with bodies aren't fast. That's where I think this goes, right? So like a cheetah is or a bird, right? They can get into the 70 mile an hour, 100 mile an hour sort of deal. But light, right? The speed of light, it's disembodied. That's why. So, we're all little Platonists here, right? The more you have a body, the slower you have to go. So if something's fast, it must be disincarnate. But it's interesting, of course, because even with the digital, I use my body to interact with it. And of course you're right. We don't see you, Brett, but like I'm looking at this microphone. I feel, these headphones. I'm using my sensorium, my five senses. But it's certainly different. But the speed, both of how it works and the speed of the change, I think makes us go, man, something. So there is something disincarnate about it. But I wonder if some of it is becoming that way because we say it's so. And we've not narrated the way in which to think of it as embodied. Weirdly enough, I think this connects back to the biological metaphors that you're making. I love this idea that the reason we need to bring up an ecology this goes to the theme of these shows, new beginning, ever ancient, ever new. Even when we're all like sort of amateur virologists now, even when we get like a new virus or even when we get a new strain of a virus, it's new. It's new enough that even old medicines don't work. But of course, it emerges from what came before. So things that are brand new and can literally in 2020 make the entire world stop working how it did, of course, didn't just come out of nothing. Nothing is creatio ex nihilo when it comes to humans or the biological world. And that's a really important metaphor, I think, when we're considering the newness of digital. It always came from somewhere. Its newness is indeed new, but it of course only makes sense deeply embodied in the past from which it comes from. To me, Brett, it's something to like the difference between a bacteria that causes us illness versus a virus. For a long time, people argued in biochemistry, is a virus alive? I think in some ways it's still an open question. Do you call a virus a living thing? Certainly it has qualities of living things. There's also a way in which they can lie dormant and all these things like this. I'm not going to get into the biology arguments that I couldn't hang with. But I think something is similar by analogy happening. Like the problems that books cause, and books cause problems, the Reformation happens because of the printing press. But in a way, right, they're bacterial. And so we sort of have antibiotics, as it were, ready to go when it comes to the problems that the text world brings up. Viruses, though, right, antibiotics don't work on that. And so we want to try to use the same solutions to bacteria, but we're in a new viral environment, and we have to think about how you approach those problems in that way. So it's a new beginning, and certainly there's things that used to work in the old way that don't work now, but they didn't come from nowhere. And certainly there's lessons that we have to learn, like fasting and things like this from prior medium for the new one. But that idea, we need to. I'm just being reminded in talking to you, it's important to remember the ecology aspect of this. Digital doesn't happen in a vacuum. It, too, is happening in an ecology. And so even though it's new, there's so much from the past that we can make sure to learn to bring in talking about this new reality of the digital age.
Yeah, that's really well put. And I didn't mean to sound like... what's the old man's name in Shawshank who gets released and he's walking around, almost gets hit by a car, and he says, the world went and got itself in a big damn hurry. Everything's so fast.
Everybody imagines you with like a monocle and a windmill. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you're right. And I want to ask you about that later because I think that's a really important point. And I'm reminded though of McLuhan's pithy phrase, that at the speed of light, every body becomes a no body. And I think what he would say about that issue with the body, he said a lot about the issue of discarnate experience and how that relates to an incarnate faith. But one of the things that gets lost in his little aphorisms or pithy quotes is what he was trying to say with this everybody becomes a nobody at the speed of light, is that you lose your identity. So there's a sort of like there's a violence that comes with the loss of identity when things travel at this speed. And I think a lot of what we're seeing, and you can kind of infer what I mean by this in terms of identity crisis, especially among young people. Who am I? What am I? I think a lot of that has to do with those very basic kind of emotional, psychological, bodily cues that come with development that were traditionally set within embodied environments of family and community and playground and so on. When you, though, start your development, I think, going back to the parenting question, when children are spending a lot of time in virtual environments, those cues aren't there. And you know, we can say, looking back as academics, well, of course, digital is just kind of the fusion of all the previous media. It's not, you know, it's not some alien force that's invaded us. It's a kind of a speeding up of print and TV and radio and fusing them together. So all it really requires, and I think you're right, is kind of a new literacy and a new kind of grammar or structure for understanding it, so that we can live well with it. I think that, going back to the ecology idea, is certainly the bottom line. But I do worry about, you know, young people who don't maybe have the luxury of, like maybe even we did, of kind of processing through the different kind of media eras, as it were, as we start with oral, you know, speech. Our parents talk to us and we babble, and there's storytelling, and then we learn to read around the, you know, 5 or 6 years old, and they read to us, and so we get kind of immersed in literacy for a while. And then, of course, the TV is always in the background for us anyway, for people who were born after, you know, 1950. That's certainly part of the environment. But it was often done with other people. So you sat around and watched a show together, and so on. And so the increasing kind of fragmentation of, you know, the media experience from those embodied contexts and those oral contexts and those kind of literate or print contexts, I think introduces a new challenge. And I think from an education and a child development standpoint, that children need to have the benefit of first knowing what it is to experience the joy of just speech and orality and storytelling and all of those things, so that when they encounter digital media, they know what those predecessors are, and they can you know, use the new tools well, because they're not illiterate on those other fronts. So I guess that's part of the speed question too, is what's happening in child development when at 2 years old you're on an iPad, and you just kind of skip over listening to stories or reading books with mom and dad, because you're right on to the games and the movies and so on. So anyway, I think you're right. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But I do worry about sort of the development of identity that comes with those experiences. And maybe we can talk more about that, because maybe I'm not being clear on what that even means.
No, I think that makes tons of sense. We are coming up to the break, so we're going to go ahead and stop there. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr talking to our good friend Brett Robinson about the new dawn of the digital age and what theology and the church have to say about it. This is The Uncommon Good. Stick around, and we'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you for listening to the new format here. We are very happy to be back to interviewing guests in the long format, and so we thought there was no one better to start this off with. If you've heard the first segment, we're going to reintroduce him, Brett Robinson, over at the McGrath Church Life Center at the University of Notre Dame. Everything to do with church communications, digital ecology, everything like that. Brett, thank you again for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you.
Now, before the break, Bud had one more question, and then we're going to jump into what we're hoping will be a fun new aspect of the format of the show, where our guest asks the question, but we're going to let Bud throw one more down. So, Bud, this better be like 5-star question. No pressure.
Oh, man. No, Brett, when you were during the first segment, you were kind of going through a litany of like challenges that we've sort of faced recently. And one that you mentioned with the experience of the pandemic was worshiping online. And when the virus was first spreading, I was sort of like really grateful for the opportunity, like, well, I can still watch Mass from my basement with my children, you know. But the actual experience of it for me felt very off. And, you know, it's sort of like, do you kneel during the consecration when you're watching from a television, you know? And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the interaction between media and the liturgy. Because, again, we can't pretend like this is the first time that the church had to think about this. You know, with the Council of Trent, there's this real push to have like a uniform missal that would kind of like create a kind of homogeny, probably sounds pejorative, but yeah, it's sort of like a shared experience of worship for Catholics across Europe, you know. But is it, I guess I'll just put it very starkly, like, is it possible to worship through a television screen?
No pressure here.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on your definition of worship. I mean, I guess watch the NFL on Sunday and ask someone what they're doing. But no, I mean, so I'm actually reading, if you don't know this book, Jesuit Antonio Spadaro has this book, Cyber Theology, where he spends quite a bit of time on this question of liturgy and media and mediated liturgy. And he even goes into, this is before COVID he's writing, but he writes about virtual worlds like Second Life, where people tried to build cathedrals and even adoration chapels where your avatar could go in and do adoration and so on. So there's definitely an impulse there and a desire to use these platforms as gateways to that kind of transcendence or that kind of exposure or experience of worship. I don't know. I think we're still learning coming out of COVID what the fruits or the bitter fruits of that are. I know a lot of people haven't come back, and they've used that kind of as a reason or excuse that, you know, they can just watch online. That does some obvious things like diminish, you know, sense of community and ecclesial communion and so on. But one of the points that Spadaro makes is that it misses the here and now aspect, the hic et nunc, right? Like there's something about the here and now, the presence, the time. You know, if we did that too, you know, when we'd watch masses from Ireland and things, so we'd actually watch, you know, a recording of a mass in the basement. So we weren't even there in time. You know, we weren't even synced time-wise with what we were watching, and that seems problematic to me, given the fact that you know, the liturgy and worship is so rooted in ideas of time and space and all those sort of elemental dimensions of reality and experience that become part of the symbolic, you know, symphony that is the liturgy. So when those are, I guess, tinkered with or virtualized or simulated, it seems like you're missing something, losing something. The other obvious thing being what we've talked about in the first segment about bodies and materiality. So sacraments obviously can't be received through a television screen. The water, the oil, the bread, the wine, the ash, all the sorts of material elements of liturgical practice. Now, I know that in the Protestant Church, there's far fewer reservations because of the lack of, I guess, materiality or sacramentality to the worship. It's really about the content. It's really about the word and the scripture and the preaching. And so I've talked to, you know, Protestants, one who goes skiing every Sunday with their family. That's kind of their worship experience. But on the way, they listen to podcasts of their favorite preacher from a church in a totally different city. And then they go spend time in nature, and that's how they do it. I wouldn't do that, but, you know, I can see why these new affordances suggest to people that that's an opportunity or an option.
See, and on this one too, like, we need to give over. But like, I think about this. There's so much great stuff going in here. I love when people go, "We're going to go spend time in nature." At a ski lodge, which is not natural in any sort of way, right? Like, ski runs are obvious, cultivated, fields aren't natural in that regard. But even in this one too, right? What I think is great about this is this brings up really questions that we should have been asking the whole time, Brett. So for instance, we're on a radio station that airs Mass. So do you attend it when you hear it on the radio? But this actually goes back all the way to when they made the books of the office. They have huge arguments that we kind of think are silly, but there are huge arguments in existence that say monks need to at least mumble when they read the prayers of the office, or they haven't prayed, they've read. So, right?
Even if they're alone.
Yeah, even if they're alone, they should at least mumble. And we go like, pshaw, right? This is just the antiquated worries of legalists. But I think they get at the heart of something. Like, what makes it, like you said, embodied present time? And I think that that gets to the heart of the issue. Is maybe we need to re-examine the mumbling monks, and that maybe they have something that we've missed this entire time. So look, to stay true to our word, we got about 12 minutes left, so we want to turn it over to you, Brett. Brett, you are now in control of questions. So this is all new to everybody, but fire away, and we'll see how this works.
Okay. So 12 minutes. So I'm curious because you both have theological training that I don't have. So all my studies were in cultural studies and communication, and I just surround myself with theologically minded people and try to absorb it by osmosis. But since I have you captive on this show now, I want to know what, from both of you, really kind of what we just dabbled in this in our conversation so far, but what theological themes jumped out to you or jump out to you when we asked these questions, when we went through this program? Like who might be the go-to in the tradition to help us think through this?
Bud, you going to go first, or you want me to?
I can take a stab at it. So when I went through the course, Brett, one thing that I kept returning to was church history and thinking about how different figures at different times tackled this perennial issue. And so, I think about like the study of St. Thomas Aquinas, and I think some scholars approach Thomas as thinking like, well, we're faithful to his legacy by kind of repeating his answers or like sharing his answers with the new generation, where I see the genius of St. Thomas as like addressing the concerns of his time, specifically with like the reintroduction of Aristotle into medieval Western thought in a lot of ways, And so we're faithful to Aquinas by imitating his art, not necessarily by repeating his questions. Of course, for myself, with my studies being primarily in the life and work of St. John Henry Newman, like the experience of the Ecology Project for me really opened my eyes to the way that Newman was responding to his times. I pulled up a quote while we were talking this morning where he says in a letter once that he wants a laity, not arrogant, not rash in speech, not disputatious, but men who know their religion, who enter into it, who know just where they stand, know what they hold, what they do not, who know their creed so well that they can give an account of it, who know so much of history that they can defend it. And I think what Newman is saying there was kind of radical at the time, because there was the idea that like you don't want the laity to delve too deeply into theological studies. That's kind of the purview of theologians and clerics. But Newman sees, like, he knows the laity they have books in their hands, and so he has to write essays that can meet them where they're at and start to answer questions about historicity, historiography that, even 60 or 70 years earlier, like a lot of laity just would not have concerned themselves with that. But they are reading Darwin and, even they're reading Anglican historians who are calling into question certain claims that the church might have made about history. So I guess, those two like really large figures in Catholic history, but both, I think, interacting with the media of their times, but also with, I guess, both of them like textual figures and the way that certain texts are entering the ecology that they're interacting in.
You know, Bud, for me, immediately Newman comes up in another way, because I think his development of doctrine actually goes well to mutually influential to understanding Brett's ecology point, and that the ecology point actually explains what he means by development of doctrine a lot better than people think. So it is like a culture, right? Like the church is sort of a culture that has all these latent things that can sprout, right? Like punctuated equilibrium given the right conditions. So it's not that like development of doctrine is like too often thought of in architectural terms, right? Like, so like we improve on what went before. There's all these latent organelles, as it were, that given the right circumstance and time will sprout, and they've always been there, but the opportunity has not yet come up. And so like I think of Newman. I also think of all those nameless monks that like contributed to the monastic gloss on the scriptural commentary, or I think of law people like Gratian, who in many ways invented the hyperlink before it was possible. For them, I think that the digital array is actually the fulfillment of a long hope that they had. I always tell people the best example of the digital is not Wikipedia's content pages, but that if you ever go on a Wikipedia rabbit trail, those connections, right? Like the idea that that's what monks wanted, right? That all knowledge could be connected, and that in service to the faculty of human memory. And I know that I've yawned on about this to you, Brett, to like anybody who would listen, but that immediately is what really came to mind theologically for me with the program. And then finally, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, no, let's stay with that, because I think you're both touching on something really important here, which is what is it to know your faith in this environment? Because if the the doctrines and the dogma and the catechism and the scriptures is at hand, as you say, in this kind of array of immediately accessible information. I'm reminded of Socrates' anxiety in the Phaedrus about even writing and forgetting. So the monks, as you know, the analogy was they were sort of eating, right? It was like when you were praying and the text was being ingested, and there was work there to internalize it. What are we doing now? Is it an IV line or like a vitamin supplement that we're able to access so quickly? And so, and does that require any work? And do we really know the faith when that's how it's accessed? So, how do you connect that vision with the actual transmission of the faith, or the experience of internalizing it and living it out?
So Bud and I both teach at a catechetical institute here in Des Moines, and I've told them many times that even a catechism is sort of a textual bastardization of what a catechesis is supposed to be, because catechesis is I have questions that I ask and the church can respond to her child asking a question, and that the catechism in many ways is an occasion for the questions. And too often, Brett, like people act like the catechism is like the encyclopedia or even the faith itself, right? Encased in the amber of the catechetical text. But the reason we keep making new catechisms is because we need to keep asking the questions in a new way. And I think that the digital allows us to re-understand that, actually to get back to the digestion and the eating metaphors. The textual makes it seem like that we have these little facts that if we have them and we have them arrayed and we know where to get them and can marshal them at will, that we know the faith. But of course, the faith is endless. It's a mystery that will go on forever. And the digital is allowing us, I hope, when we teach these people the catechism, is to be an occasion, as it were, to be infected by the truth of the faith. Again, this is another one that I always yawn on about. I actually think in the New Age, it's the virus. We need to be viral with the faith. We are vectors for being infected with the truth of the faith, and that's a much better metaphor than simply transmission or like telephone operators that people ask their question about the faith and then we point to where they can get it.
There's really go ahead, Brett.
No, go ahead, Bo. Or Bob.
There's really creative work being done with all this. This is kind of a simplistic observation, but I'm grateful for Eucharistic communion and the incarnational nature of our worship. I think part of our calling today, our task today, is to use like the new media as creatively. When we visited Pittsburgh as part of the course, we went to like St. Anthony's Chapel, and you could do some really interesting things with digital media and all of the relics that are housed there. But I think when we have that kind of outreach, we're also always drawing people back to the incarnational element. So the digital space can spark thoughts and spark questions. It can cast a vision, but the church still needs to be about like the Lord's Day communion, the feeding of the poor, caring for those who are sick. And those things I think have, even though with medicine today we do have, the digital mediation of it, they do have an incarnational piece that's indispensable.
Yeah, and you guys know better than anyone in a health science college what that means, and that's why your work is so important. And I'm glad you guys got to do the program and apply it there. I wonder in the minute or so we have left, like how what we've talked about has translated into that kind of practical environment of leading others and teaching others in the environment where you find yourselves.
Yeah, I wish that we could say that they're immediate success stories. The biggest deal is that it sort of gave us a front row seat. I'll say this about myself, Bud. You can chime in too. What seems like obvious binary questions, like should we all come back in person or should we just all go online? There's a way in which, Brett, what I think anyone who interacts with your work comes away with, they don't necessarily have to be big philosopher dorks like we all are about it. But I hope that everyone who interacts with your work goes away saying the media that we use are not just tools, right? They're not just dumb tools that we harness as we'd like. They can be used as tools, but they very much are extensions of ourselves, another McLuhan point. And so it's not for nothing that we have to decide how we're going to engage with them, realizing that even if I myself choose not to do anything online, the world is completely changed and online. It is irreducibly that. You can't even be like the Unabomber and go to a field and not have this world be a digital world that has a sort of digital cloud surrounding it. So when it comes to the practicality, Bud, that to me is what we've had very different from the opportunities we had with the CCEP, is to try to tell people that it's not just a matter of yay or nay, should we use the digital? It's that we have students whose very understanding about what they're even here to learn and how they do it is so fundamentally and radically reshaped compared to even the sort of text-dominated academic world we entered all this in.
Yeah, I've seen how important it is to try to share and mediate some of these insights to our faculty and academic leaders, because as we face the questions of students struggling, that's the objective fact. This student didn't meet the grade in the course. The temptation, I think, for myself, for our faculty, is to say well, there must be facts that they didn't get. And I'm going to steal an idea from Bo. He's pointed out to me, remediation has to do with acclimating oneself to a new media. And so it's a two-way course. Our faculty have to ask, how are we teaching, and how is that impacting the way that students are learning? On top of that, do we have assessments in place that don't fit the ecology within which we're operating? And that's probably another episode.
Or 5. So, Brett, we have reached the time here, but
I have one last question.
Okay.
One very, very brief question.
Yes, good.
I want to do this one more time, but I want all my answers to be generated by ChatGPT and to see if you can tell the difference.
Okay.
Ooh, that would be. We were talking about ChatGPT yesterday in a meeting, and I would welcome that opportunity.
So just a whole episode with fake robot Brett answers or questions?
Well, no, it would be Brett and robot Brett, and you guys would have to figure out who's speaking with each answer.
Oh my gosh. Wait, we might have to do this show. All right. Well, we'll plan that next episode. But until then, Brett, please tell the good listeners where they can go run into your work, or even places to start considering these very important questions.
Sure. So main place to go is mcgrath.nd.edu. That site has the Church Communications Ecology Program information on it. It also has all the other wonderful offerings from the McGrath Institute. And I also commend the Church Life Journal, where some articles I've written about this appear, along with a lot of other excellent articles that touch on similar themes. So Church Life Journal and mcgrath.nd.edu.
And the other place that I would throw in, if you go to YouTube and if you look at the Notre Dame Ethics Conference and put Bo Bonner and Brett Robinson, we have a talk called Digital Temples of the Holy Ghost, and I think I know I'm bragging, but I think we did a great job, and I hope people go check that out as well. Brett, thank you for being our guinea pig. I myself like the format, and I can't wait for people to hear the show. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you guys. God bless.
This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr will be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I don't mean to brag, but I just think we want to say you're welcome to the listeners, because that was a fantastic interview. I don't know about you, man. It feels great to be back into doing the long-form interviews.
No, it was great. I mean, I'm always like sort of thrilled with an interview where I go into it like, what can we communicate? But I take a lot away from the conversation. So I'm tempted to drive to South Bend this weekend to just to find Brett, just
to go down there. Brett, of course, being in some ways, right? Like you, like I surround myself with similar friends. Brett reminds me of you in that, like, he's a calming influence in many ways. Like, left to his own accord, maybe he'd like sit there and listen. But you throw a spark, like I don't know, maybe a Bo Bonner in there, and then you get you and Brett saying hilarious stuff. It was wonderful just to be a part of the program. But scarred in a good way is the best way I'd say this. I can never look at these questions ever again in the same way.
Well, you mentioned that presentation that you and Brett had the privilege of doing together, and I think you all do complement each other well. They talk about thunder and lightning or salt and pepper. I'm trying to think of an NFL backfield that I could compare you guys to.
Oh, yeah. Well, so we should think of it in terms of the Steelers, because Brett, of course, is a Yinzer himself, Pittsburgh. So one of us, I'm probably the bus, and then, like, who was the wide receiver that they would throw to in their Super Bowl year?
Maybe Charlie Ward.
That's right. I think Brett would be happy to be called Charlie Ward.
As long as he's not invited to take my spot on the show. I'm fine with you guys doing like the American tour or whatnot, but I'm attached to this seat.
Oh, yeah. No, and I think, look, I do want to say, like, I've heard people, they've complimented us on the sort of year-long thing that we did with the 30-minute show, where we talked about leadership. Very proud of that, hoping that some interesting things can come from that too, Bud. But, man, when we get to going on the interviews, again, sorry to like be bragging about ourselves, people, but this to me is where you and I shine, the back and forth talking with guests. I just didn't want it to end. Like, I feel like we just got started off, and I hope that warms up questions for people themselves, and that they'll go explore not only, of course, what Brett's up to, but just this larger question about the world of the church interacting with the digital reality that we face.
Well, I don't think it was false humility or self-deprecation or anything like that on his part, but when he talked about, like, the students have surpassed the master, I might have to politely disagree with him on that one. And I truly invite our listeners, like, if you're involved in a parish or have a leadership role, to think about inviting Brett to speak there. I think he approaches all these topics in really creative ways, but he could give a lot of grist for the mill as parishes and parents and teachers think about using media in ways that are consonant with the faith and that can really transform lives.
I absolutely believe that. Now, Bud, to do our digital part, wherever you're listening, the Catholic stations that either you're listening to this through or on occasion of because of the digital world, make sure to think about donating. It's through your donations that make Catholic radio possible. So all of our Iowa listeners, or even people outside of it, I hope you would donate to Iowa Catholic Radio. You can go to iowacatholicradio.com to hit the donate button. Of course, you can listen live to our show when it airs, all sorts of other local shows through iowacatholicradio.com and the Iowa Catholic Radio app. And we encourage you to make sure to go check out your local Catholic station to see what you're doing in the diocese. We talk about an incarnational faith, but there's plenty going on in the Diocese of Des Moines where we record from. iowacatholicradio.com has all of that good work. But like if people want to join us here in Iowa with the prayer life, what are the times that people here on Iowa Catholic Radio do prayers?
Yeah, speaking of media, if you download the Iowa Catholic Radio app, you can pray the rosary anytime, anywhere. But we also broadcast the rosary either live if you're listening in Iowa, or you can listen through the website at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. The Divine Mercy Chaplet is prayed at 2:55 p.m., so some great ways to join in the prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio.
And sacraments we don't know the answer to, but with prayer, if you're moving your lips, you're praying, and so you can pray along with the radio too. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, our city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. For Dr. Bud Marr and everybody here at Iowa Catholic Radio, this is Bo Bonner. Thank you for listening to the show, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.